Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this, the seventh and final part of our series titled Wasted: Small Efforts for Big Change. The program is planned around a series of conversations about waste, environmental justice, and the role we all play in the future of sustainability. I'm Tony Marino, Executive Director of the Rockfall Foundation. Founded in 1935, our mission is to promote and support environmental education and conservation in the lower Connecticut River Valley. Please go to rockfallfoundation.org to find out more. Rockfall has been pleased to collaborate with the following co-sponsors: City of Middletown, the Lower Connecticut River Valley Council of Governments, better known as RiverCog, and Wesleyan University Sustainability Office. This program could not have happened without the assistance of many individuals, in particular Cheryl Baldwin, Janice Ehlemeyer, Jen Kleindienst, Kim O'Rourke, and members of the Rockfall Program Committee. A special shout out to Liz Brittany, the Communication and Grants Coordinator at Rockfall, as she will be managing the mechanics of our program tonight, and to Michelle Ekman, Program Consultant to Rockfall, whose efforts have made this series possible. I want to say thank you to all of them. The Rockfall Foundation acknowledges the heritage of the indigenous people of the state of Connecticut and the importance of protecting the natural resources on their land on which we live, work, and play. The Rockfall Foundation also recognizes that prejudice and injustice exist in our society and is committed to practicing inclusiveness in the services and programs we offer and supporting environmental and social justice. This series of waste has been about choices each of us make every day to be better stewards of our environment. Whether it is understanding how we live affects our communities and the communities that surround us, especially communities of color and of the underserved. Understanding where your trash goes today and how it will be processed and what the future of waste management holds. We also discuss taking responsibility for our own waste decisions by auditing what we are throwing away and adjusting to the effective reduction of our waste. We learned about the importance of advocacy on both the local and state level, and learned about environmental legislation that is before the Connecticut legislature and how we might have an effect on passage of those bills. We learned how to repair rather than discard, and the negative impact of trends like fast fashion. Today, we will learn about organics in the waste stream and how we can have an effect on the environment by turning those materials into usable compost. So let's get going. Today, we'll be taking questions after each speaker. You can put your questions to chat at any time, however, or we will recognize you by the raised hand feature in the Zoom toolbar. To get going, I'd like to introduce Domingo Medina. Domingo is an educator and a human geographer with degrees in natural resource management and community development. Domingo worked in the Venezuelan rainforest environments on the issues of resource conservation planning, land rights, land use change, and eco-health needs of the local populations. In New Haven, Domingo has been involved in farming, producing organic food, and learning about the links between healthy soils and plants, nutritious food, and human health. Domingo is a certified UConn master composter and a certified compost operation manager. He's founder and director of operations of Peels and Wheels Composting, a neighborhood pedal-powered food scrap pickup and composting service that promotes community composting in New Haven. Domingo currently is a Connecticut NOFA board member and helps people in his community find waste management and soil amending solutions through a variety of methods. Domingo, I'm turning it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to have an audience that is willing to hear what you have to say, interested in the same things that I'm interested in. So you will have two parts. I'll be talking first, and then Dom will follow. I'm gonna give you my perspective of why we need to do composting. I believe that we are being caught ourselves with our pants down. We are in an era of superpopulation, and all the systems that we have devised to deal with our waste are basically getting to their limits, of the capacity of their life, and it's gonna hit us back, and it's gonna hit us hard if we do not start to change the way we relate to our place and to our environment. So I'm going to share with you a presentation, and hopefully it will give you a better understanding of what I'm trying to say. Please let me know if you can see my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. You just need to make it
Yeah.
full screen.
Yeah. I'm trying to, there you go. Okay. So looking at all these list of topics that have been taken through these webinars, the way I see it is that these are all things that are interrelated. And of course, our doing, the way we interrelate with our place, with our environment, has impacts, has effects. And there are effects that are not distributed equally. There are communities more than others that they are able to cope with these effects and impacts, and they are much more vulnerable because of many circumstances. But here, I think one of the most important environmental justice that people don't talk much about is this justice from the point of view of nature, which we all depend. We tend to always see and judge about how this impacts human beings without really touching upon how it's touching, who's speaking in the name of our place and our environment, which we are all integrated. So all this boils down to what Tony Marino was talking about is our behavior, the choices that we're making, the decisions that we're making, the way we tend to decide on how to deal and manage our resources, and in particular, in this case, our waste. So we're talking about, when we talk about composting, we talk about losses and waste of food, and the compost, the end of it, we are just capturing the part of discarding these organic residues that are occurring at different levels. But if you look at it, if you really trace from the production point of view, there's a lot of food that's being lost at the farm level. Sometimes we have overproduction. Sometimes we have issues of climate that might have an impact and damage our crops, and more now with climate change. We have pests and animals, and of course, we want to produce a food with certain aesthetics that can be pleasing for markets and for our consumers. And there's a significant amount of food that's being lost along the way. Then just the handling of the food before, even if it's purchased, there's a lot of food that has been lost along the way. And then when it comes to the point of food consumption, we see a lot of food that's being lost and that's being consumed. We see in schools, we see in cafeterias, in food services, that we can see that it's an issue of planning, it's an issue of adequate provision of quality food, and also people's taste and what they want to eat and so on. And of course, at American homes, there's a lot of food waste that come from not only about using this about when to use, buy, or best buy label that we find in many of our food, but sometimes we don't store it properly, or we over purchase, and then we produce a lot, and then we are throwing it out. And I see it on a weekly basis because I collect particularly food scraps. And on average here in New Haven, and I think this is equal to many parts of the United States, it's around 10 pounds of food scraps, of organics that people throw out on a weekly basis. I have a household that throws 25 pounds, 30 pounds. And then of course you have the ones that produce very little, but an average 10 pounds, which adds a lot, as I'm going to be able to show. So the question is why? Why at all these spaces we are overproducing? And there's a lot of environmental costs, social costs associated with this. All the investment that we have done in trying to improve the soil, for soil management, to produce high quality food, all the water that we have been using, the labor behind it, all the investment we have done in agriculture, and then we have the luxury of throwing out food. And one of the explanation is that we are not recognizing the true cost of our actions, and we are just pushing the wrinkle. We are hoping that somebody else is going to, picking up those, and we move on with that. And we don't internalize that in our day-by-day basis. And we don't see it reflected in the cost of a product. So somebody else is picking up this cost, and that's something that it shouldn't be. Okay, didn't change. Okay, there you go. So in the literature, you can look at all these phases where we lose and waste food, and the distinction between loss and waste, which I described there. But basically has to do with all the discarding of edible and inedible commodities and food at different stages. And that's a sad story of it. The key is that we don't really understand the full measurement in monetary terms of the externality cost associated with the environmental impact that we generate. We don't assume that, once it's out of the house, that's it. I don't feel it. It doesn't impact me directly. I mean, we think it doesn't impact us directly, but it does in some way if you think about it. And something that I call upon the people in this audience is to reflect what's happening in your community, how we are dealing with our losses and waste of food, and if there's a way to understand it, and if there's a way to internalize it, to be able to start minimizing those losses. In the case of farms, everybody have seen in farmers market this notion of the importance of closing the loop. No farms, no food. Let's support farms. And farms have this. Farms are struggling between producing a yield to have a livelihood, and also to enhance their soil and soil conservation and healthy soil, which is not part of the cost. Which is not incorporated in the cost of production of food. And we want the cheapest food that is most nutritious, but we're not willing to afford, the true cost of it. That's something that we just think that a farmer should be able to assume. So when it comes to dealing with a reasonable way to reduce food waste, this is something you probably are familiar with this inverted triangle. The USDA one has one that promotes it. This is from the Institute of Local Self-Reliance, and the proposition. I think everybody knows what needs to be done. One thing is to what's the reasonable thing to do, and I think your capability, your decision making. How can we deal with this? And you have seen the first one is a source reduction. It has to do with prevention, and it has to do with planning of not overbuying food or overproducing food. Planning. I see it in schools. It's incredible amount of waste of the way we provide food in our schools and gets thrown away. So if there's a way, and of course you see all this movement around food rescue, which are mostly volunteers. And nobody pays you to save food. It's a value of among several organizations that I say, listen, we cannot waste it. We have to, distribute it. And you see that people are rescuing food and giving it to people, to organizations like food bank and the soup kitchens and other organizations like churches. And then you are people that are taking actually some food to animals and farms and so on. But if you can't do that because now food is not as edible, they already started to decompose. One thing that you can immediately do is to start doing home composting. You can do backyard composting, you can do vermicomposting, you can do bokashi. There are several methods out there. And of course, it requires to have space. It requires to have certain time, certain training. It's a management system, as Dawn is going to explain. But not everybody has the capability of having space all the time, all the knowledge, all the interest. So can you bring it to a community garden that's composting? Can you bring it to a farm that's also interested in composting? Or can you pay for service if there's a service around you that can do that? what you want to minimize is try to reduce is, taking all this nice organic material and going back to landfills and incinerators. As you know, we don't have landfills anymore in Connecticut. They're still there. They're still producing methane. They're still decomposing and generating a lot of negative environmental impact. But there's no more feeding into them. And now what we're seeing is, we have been burning a lot of our trash. All cities have contracts. We have been burning it, at least in New Haven, in Bridgeport and Hartford, and very soon the municipal incinerator Hartford is going to close, and that's why the urgency of the state. Oh well, let's incentivize. How can we start doing things differently? So it's interesting when you look at the history, and you still have a lot of places, a lot of houses here in New Haven where you have all these garbage receivers that were very well functioning until the mid 20th century, and people would separate the garbage, the food scraps, from the rubbish, and that was the term that will be utilized. And here in New Haven, there was people that actually collected this garbage with horses and carriage, and will take it to a farm, a hog farm, to feed the hogs, that the hogs then will feed people. And there was a very famous, they call it the poor farm, something that's still researching. But the link between the garbage and farming was very important until the mid 20th century, until population grew so much to a point that it was very difficult to collect, and they had a lot of health-related issues and odors and stuff, until somebody invented the landfills, and we went to a whole era of landfills, which generated another issue until we have to close. At the same time, municipal incinerators were created to generate electricity, but they were also generating environmental justice issues by generating a lot of pollution into the air. And now we are in the era of anaerobic digesters here, which are 5 plants here in Connecticut, only 1 in functioning, as you may know. And so we still have to haul. We still have to collect and haul all this material. And you're starting to see now a lot of businesses that are going around towns collecting organics. But this is to produce methane for gas production, and the digest that comes from this anaerobic digester still needs to be proven to be used for soils. That digest needs to be composted still, and still need to be tested to see of its quality. And that's another term of discussion. But the key here is why composting, and I just going to touch upon the upper part. There's a lot of benefits around composting, if that I'm sure Dawn is just going to talk about. But when I started this, I was concerned about where my food scrap was going, and I learned that 35 to 40% of the weight that we put in our trash are basic organic residues: jar trimmings, food scraps, paper, and other organic materials. And of course, I soon understood that there was a relationship between environmental pollution and human health. In the case of New Haven, somebody was asking about what's happening with our wastewater, with all these organics that go through our drainage. In New Haven, that basically goes down to the water company. The water company separates the solids from the water, chlorinates the water, and throw it into the sound, and then burns the solid. So for me, it's not a solution. It's just been pushing the wrinkle into how we have been dealing with for our food scrap. And then I learned, that all our food scraps are being burned. So it wasn't a solution. So I started doing composting. It was can we try to divert some of those organic and make it an asset and a resource for my community. The other people that are looking at more soil conservation, enhancement of soil to improve the soils. Others are concerned about closing the loop, bringing back those organics for food production. Each time a farmer removes crops from the land. You're losing all that nutrients that were invested in those plants are taken out, and somehow we need to restore the ecology, the soil biology, the livelihood of the soil, and sometimes some soils need some amendments and one way to do it is through composting. And of course, the issue of waste management, and that's the major concern of city to town, is let's get rid of our waste as soon as possible, because it's a lot and we don't want to accumulate. And so they're not thinking about the end use. They are looking at the waste management. For me, it's about because there's a value in both. And that's something I think we're going to highlight. So I mentioned this already, what we're trying to solve. We burn everywhere, and you can see this is a map of the composters in New England. This is an old map. But in the case of New Haven, we have one of the highest incidence of pulmonary cancer in the state, with New London and Bridgeport. This is an old graphic. I need to update it. And we also have the same issue with the asthma associated. The cost, the health related cost of all these health problems are linked to environmental pollution. And I'm not saying because incineration is generating this, but if you have a population that's already sick and you're polluting your air, we haven't resolved the issue. We are blinded about the impacts and the relationship of these practices. And of course, in places like New Haven and New London and Bridgeport, where you want to grow food, there's a major movement of growing food. And more in the time of COVID. It's amazing the amount of people that went out and started to do raised beds. We have degraded soils with very poor soils that are being, that has lead, that has arsenic, that has other contaminants, that don't have water holding capacity, doesn't have capacity to hold nutrients, degraded soil that need to be enhanced. And the recommendations in many places is that you want to grow food, you have to go and do raised beds. And sometimes you have to bring soil from afar, and you have to bring compost from afar. So that's a major issue. And of course, this is what I mentioned to you already, the pressure on the farms to, protect their soil and work with soil health, at the same time trying to produce a livelihood with producing good yields. And I think the compost has a major role on improving the amount of organic matter in the soil and to help in this regard. And this I explained already. So if you are able to look at the face of what's happening in your own town, in your own community, these are things that are very easy to calculate. If you have a transfer station, I'm sure there's data of tonnage of material from recyclables and from trash that are being received in the transfer station. And there you can calculate easily 35% or 40% of the weight of that tonnage is organic matter. And then you can start saying, well, what's the cost of a tipping fee of a tonnage for your community? And then you can start looking at the monetary values of waste, and who's paying for that. And we do it through taxes, and we certainly paying in a way that of a budget allocation. We could be using that money for something else, but we're using it for waste management. So in New Haven, the number of households around 49,000 households. The average, as I said, is 10 pounds per week. That's around 250 tons of material on a weekly basis that are being thrown out, that's being trashed. And that's a calculation of the metric tons of CO2 that waste is generating. And that doesn't take into account the hauling, the picking up of that trash and then the hauling of it to the transfer station. And then from the transfer station, the hauling that goes to the incinerators. So there's the environmental cost is much higher in this regard. And we're talking about 13,000 tons per year. And this is a low estimation because this is just based on my estimate of organics, but it's much more based on the data of the transfer station. You can say, if you want to have a dimension of what this means, in terms of a weekly basis or what you're throwing away, is around 132, compact cars per week. Imagine a parking lot, 132 cars. That's more or less the dimension of the amount of stuff that we're throwing away on a weekly basis. And of course, and this is just an estimate of the cost to dispose of it based on the tipping fee, just the tipping fee. So at the end of the year, New Haven is spending just on tipping fees like $1,237,000 a year. Imagine what we can do with that amount of money in a city where you already are under budgeted, where you already dealing with the lack of enough resources to fund your own needs. So, again, I invite you to understand where things are happening at your own community. In our case, everything goes to a transfer station, and then we don't have landfills anymore. Things are going to municipal incinerators, and it looks like people are now finding solution in trying to separate the organics from the trash, and now send it. We only have one in the whole state, and so they certainly are benefiting from this regard, but still you have to travel a lot. This is in Southington, and to be able to take it to Southington, you need companies like Blue Earth Compost that have to travel miles and miles and miles to go and towns and pick up these organics and bring it in. And so unless we start developing more anaerobic digester, which are huge, very costly, billions of dollars we're talking about, a technology that generates very little jobs. We have to look for ways to create more opportunities to deal with our food waste, more closer to our towns and cities. So this diagram just shows that what I'm trying to do with composting is to try to divert a percentage of what I can manage out of the mainstream and create composting in an urban farm in New Haven, which have been generating a lot of benefits. So it is not a solution for all the compost all the organic waste that has been produced in the city. But listen, we can replicate models like this in many places and generate the benefits that I see too. So basically, the importance of compost is that, we can reduce waste. One of the most important things, without waste, we can enhance our soils. It's amazing the amount of benefit that compost alone can do to improve the soil around us, in our gardens, in our community gardens, in our urban farms, in our trees, in our parks. For soil erosion, there are many uses that compost has, alternatively to trying just to burn it in some other place. And of course, we can build community by composting together, not only at the backyard, but bringing a pool of resources within a community where we can manage those resources and replicate this in our neighborhoods. And there's a good example down in New York City that was very well functioning, paid by the sanitation department. A lot of interesting, diverse type of systems of composting that were being supported by the city, which has now have come down to basically to a stop because of COVID. But there's a lot of examples to learn there from there. In my case, this is how I justify community composting. Why we compost? Well, by diverting food waste from municipal incineration and towards composting, we reduce the cost of waste and environmental pollution in New Haven linked to human health. And we have a chance to create rich soil amendments for growing plants and food in our place while creating local jobs. So that's the other dimension, is that by capturing and keeping that resources within our community, we can generate a lot of goods and benefits, including jobs in our own place, which many of our towns and cities need. So when we talk about green jobs, this is certainly a very clear green job that can be stimulated. So just to define it as a movement, community composting is an environmental movement, and there's a lot of diverse communities out there. Very interesting in closing the loop on organics recovery. Again, seeing as the principle here is to see these organic resources as an asset for the community and try to reinvest it and keep it in. And this is, you know, and this can be then earmarked to green projects in your own community. Again, for urban farms, community garden, parks, urban trees. And it can take different forms and scales, you know, from backyard composting to, you know, more smaller, you know, even mid-scale facilities like the one I have in New Haven. And you can be establishing so many resources. I work in the back of a parking lot of a business, but you have spaces in schools, you have spaces in parks, you have spaces in so many places within our towns and cities where we can establish and incorporate these systems. You know, you can get, there are many out there, we're like 140 or more under the Institute of Local Self-Reliance, and some of them are non-for-profit, other co-ops, associations, other businesses. So there are many ways you can get organized around this to these two functions. And these can be managed by volunteers, by community groups, by paid job, by local government. Here's an issue of political will. Can I invest and decentralize a little bit, you know, the management of our waste, and try to create pilots so we go through a learning curve of how to deal with this. Of course, and it's important here that you rely on community participation to work together, to support and to pool resources, whether monetary level, monetary or labor force or space force. But here, the idea of community compost is that you end up educating the public, you know, the residents about environmental stewardship by food scrap. Once you start seeing this on the face, and not just, you know, all your scraps in a bin and far away, but you deal it and face on a weekly basis, then you understand, you know, why this is so much important need. And of course, you want to do it in a way that you meet some standards. You know, you want to be able to do high quality compost. You want to be able to deal with nuisances like, you know, pests and odors. And that's part of learning the skills about composting. This is just a map of how many community composting groups are around the US. I said, I think I had like 140 or more. And we are organized. We, you know, we meet once a year. We talk about our different, you know, where we are, what we need, what we're doing, you know, technology, skills, resources, financing. We're talking about insurance. We're talking about, you know, policies. There's so many things around this. That are, I think, that's a very interesting movement. And these are just examples. People using bikes, people using trailers, and using you know, small pickup or other trucks. Others have become much more sophisticated. But again, the idea is to recirculate these resources within our communities. And this is an example of, you know, I cover with my service, you know, around eight miles radius around the center where I do the composting, and all this done by bike, the system that I have. So, you know, it can be a very lower cost investment to start system like this, and then you know, you don't have to cover a city. You can, you know, just work on neighborhood levels and have people investing in systems like this. So it's feasible in many ways. And this just to illustrate, you know, the type of technology we use. I have a little photograph there on the lower left corner, comparing, you know, a big truck that might cost $200,000 or $300,000 for picking up trash, and my bike with a trailer that picked up a significant amount of food scraps on a weekly basis. And this also just to illustrate, you know, all the synergy that goes around what you do. You know, one thing that I do is I pick up everything with a small bucket. I give a small bucket to everybody, and I'm able to see what they're putting in. I can provide feedback of what they're putting in, what's compostable or not. I have an app that I can talk to my composters and educate ourselves about what's compostable or not. And then I give compost back, you know, for people to be able to use it for their gardens and the flowers and their raised beds and so on. So is a model of doing things. And this just a summary of what I've collected since 2014. You know, almost 400,000 pounds I diverted through the system that I manage. And these are the equivalent in terms of metric tons of CO2 that we have avoided. And we have produced a significant amount of cubic yards of food, of compost. So the value for us, again, is to minimize environmental pollution, enhance the soils, and create jobs in systems of composting. And that's it, what I have to say. I wanted to provide a background of what triggered me to do what I do with Peels and Wheels composting, with getting out with detail. It boils down to composting, and that's what Dawn's going to be talking about. What Dawn will tell you are basically the fundamentals of composting that can be for backyard composting to the larger composting operations. The principles are the same. And this is something that we have to learn, that we have to practice. And there's a lot of resources out there. There's a lot of support from the UConn Master Composting Program. And then there's a lot of interesting learning curve that has been happening around the state where we can, learn from and see how we can adapt in our community. The key here is to understand the nature of our situation within our own communities and see how, composting, backyard composting, community composting can play a role in diversifying the way we're dealing with our waste and reduce the cost of waste with our own town, and then utilize those resources to invest, to have those organics back in our soil, in our own movements, in our own needs.
Domingo, I'd like to leave some time for some people to ask some questions.
Yeah, thank you very much.
No, thank you very much. I'd ask people now to either add some questions to the chat or use the raise hand function. We'll take a couple questions now, and then we'll have a combined question period after Dawn speaks.
Thank you.
Please, question?
While we give people a moment to think, we'll ask Rick's first question from earlier in the chat, where he wants to know, doesn't composting generate methane, and sort of a little bit more about those impacts of composting.
Okay, so I didn't define composting. I certainly was giving the answer to Dawn, but composting is an aerobic process. Each time you have methane, it's because you have anaerobic conditions within your compost process, and that's something you eliminate by managing, the amount of oxygen that are in your compost bins or your compost pile. Okay, and the amount of methane that is produced is never as high as having a landfill. A landfill, you have a lot of pockets of anaerobic conditions, and therefore you have anaerobic microbes that are the ones that do the decomposition process through very acidic and very high alcoholic conditions, where methane are being produced. So if you're doing things right, you provide the oxygen, you are bringing in all those nice microbes that work under aerobic condition, and therefore methane is not produced or is very little produced.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Well,
I can ask a follow-up to that question. Do we have time, Tony, for another question?
Sure. Yes.
So I guess I've never put two and two together, but your explanation, Domingo, really helped. So that means that anaerobic digestion, like the one in Southington, is explicitly generating methane, but containing it and then using that to generate energy, correct?
That's correct. I think, people call it anaerobic composting, and I think it's a wrong use of the term. Is not composting, and I've seen that being used the wrong way or as a marketing. People expect, oh, I'm going to have compost back from the anaerobic digester, and it's still, you have to take that digest and compost it because it's not a stable material that's coming out there. And I haven't seen yet compost from those digests and to be applied. You need to test those composts to see if they're not harmful for plants, for instance. And I haven't seen any report about it. But yeah, there's a major difference of how these decomposition processes happen. Okay,
great. Again, we'll have more questions and hopefully answers at the end of our next presentation. Now I'd like to introduce Dawn Pettinelli, Dawn is an associate extension educator at the University of Connecticut, and she manages the UConn Soil Nutrition Analysis Laboratory. The facilities provide information, testing, and advice to homeowners and commercial clientele. In 2009, she developed the UConn Master Composting program, which is now in its 10th year. I turn it over to Dawn. Thank you, John.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And I'm hoping that everybody who's been listening to Domingo can see how composting really can make a difference. And there really is no reason for most people not to be able to compost at all. I know we can't always make a difference in a lot of things in our lives. There's so many things that we'd like to change, but just by composting, whether it's something small like a worm bin, whether it's in your backyard, whether it's at a community garden, can make a difference. And it's something that we all can do. So I'm going to talk just about, again, this will be sort of brief, but about the principles of composting. And Liz, I don't know if you want to pull up my presentation or do you want me to share or what? Here we go. So if anybody has any questions and wants to reach me, email is actually the best way. Feel free to check out the Soil Testing Lab's website too, because I have about a dozen or so compost fact sheets on it. So you're welcome to peruse through them. And there's also the UConn Home and Garden Education Center, which I also run, has a website, the Ladybug website. And we have over 100 fact sheets on all aspects of gardening. So, you know, they're there for to spread our knowledge, to share it with you. And if you can read whichever ones you want. If you have any questions, email either Ladybug or email me. Okay, next. So I really like this little definition of composting. Fred Magdoff is from the UVM, and he's written a bunch of books on organic matter and composting and how important it is. And he talks about it, and it's part art, it's part science. And it's combining whatever organic waste you have at your disposal. You want them to decompose, and ideally they'd form an end product that you can use in the garden, in the finished garden. So today, next. So today we'll cover just a little bit about the benefits of composting. I cannot possibly go through all of the benefits that Domingo went through. It really does affect our society from very small scale to a very, very huge scale. But I'll just talk a little bit as far as how they relate to soil. I'll give you some idea of how you might want to get started. We can do some basic troubleshooting, some of the common questions that we end up getting. And then what do you do with your compost if you haven't figured that out already when you're done with it? So next. So there's, look at making compost like making zucchini bread. There are so many recipes for zucchini bread, and really and truly, have you ever tasted a bad loaf of zucchini bread? No, they all come out good regardless of what recipe you use. And compost is sort of the same way. You're going to form your own recipe depending upon what materials you have at your disposal, what you have in your kitchen, what you have in your house, what you have in your yards, what you have in your gardens, and you're going to manage it so that you will produce a vital end product for your soil. Next. So, why compost? Well, obviously, it's really a good way to recycle organic waste. We don't want to be putting them in the trash. We pay for it through our taxpayer dollars. We pay for it through, if you pay a hauler to come and pick up your trash each week, it gets, whether it's on a individual level or a town level or municipal level or city level or state or whatever. We have all this organic waste, this heavy wet stuff, and we need to think of a better way to use it and to not throw away valuable nutrients. But from a soil perspective, many people don't realize that the pH of finished compost is 7. So if you're using compost, hopefully in moderation in your garden, oftentimes that negates the need for you to purchase limestone or to use wood ashes or anything else to raise the pH. From a soils perspective, our native soils usually have a pH somewhere between 4 and 5.5, and that's perfectly fine if you're growing native plants. However, many of us in our gardens want to grow things like tomatoes or marigolds, or maybe we want to grow lilacs, and all of these plants are not native, and you would need to change the pH of the soil, and you can do that when you're adding compost. It improves drainage, because what happens when you add compost to the soil, it causes soil aggregation to occur, and you get good aggregation, little soil particular matters. You get good spaces for air and water to travel. Compost adds nutrients. Depending upon what you add to your compost will depend upon what kind of nutrients it adds. It acts, all sources of organic matter, whether it's compost or whether it's something like peat moss, or whether it's bags of humus that you buy, whatever, or shredded or rotted leaves. All of these organic materials that you add to your soil, well, they act like a giant sponge. They hold more water, so you won't have to need to add as much. And that's really good, because with climate change, we're seeing more and more drought conditions during some of our summers. And also there's been actual studies being done that have been done at the Connecticut Egg Experiment Station in New Haven. And there was a woman down there that was doing experiments on adding compost and to soil and using compost teas, and noticing that in some cases it can suppress some different types of soil-borne and other diseases on your plants. So there's a lot of good reasons to use compost. Some of the reasons that people don't want to compost, next, would include, people think it stinks, and realistically, you take a bucket of food scraps and you just dump it into a big pile, and yes, it would stink, but that's not what composting is. So you would manage your pile so that you're not going to be producing any kind of foul odors. Does it going to attract animals? Yes and no. There's a good chance, even if you manage it correctly, depending upon your location, it can. There are problems in more urban areas of attracting rodents, which are undesirable. I've seen plans for school composters, because some of the schools obviously are in more urban areas or more suburban areas, and they could have problems, and they actually will make bins that you can make sure that are pretty much rodent proof. Someone had asked a question about bears. That's a little bit harder a bear is a pretty determined creature. And so, we would suggest basically that if you really do have a bear problem, you might not be able to compost in the normal way. Maybe you would have to do some, bury it, do some deviations, whatever, but you can not put out food scraps that would attract the bear anyways. You can bury it. There are some techniques that you could try. I won't guarantee that it's going to keep every single positively, creature that you don't want in your yard in there. Yes, it will attract insects. Insects are part of the decomposers that will break down the organic matter so that the microbes can decompose it further and convert it from organic matter that we recognize to, nutrient-rich compost. Do you need time to tend the pile? Realistically, you can do as much work or as little work as you want. If you want to just put everything in a pile and just leave it, it's going to rot occasionally. That's not really composting, but it's better still than putting your food scraps in the trash. And on the other hand, you could go out there and you could turn it every single week. So it really depends how much time you want to put into it. Do you need land? If you have an apartment, you could always have a worm bin. It doesn't take up much room at all. If you make too much vermicompost, which is really kind of hard to do with a small bin, I'm sure that you have gardener friends who would be more than willing to use it. And really and truly, unless you have an operation like Domingo's, it's really hard for a typical family to produce too much end product. And again, if you have an overabundance of compost, I'm pretty sure you'll be able to find someone that would be willing to take it off your hands. All right, next. So in a nutshell, and I'll go into these in a little bit more detail, you want to either build a bin, buy a bin, find a spot where you could put your organic waste, and you'd like to put it somewhere where you're going to go out and you're going to carry your organic waste too. If you put it way back in the backyard, and you might not think about it, so you might want to put it closer to your garden. You might want to put it someplace where you could actually bring a hose to in case it gets too dry in the summer and you really want to hot compost. So you would find a spot for it. You would put your food waste, your garden waste, your leaves in it. You would manage layers of we'll talk about green and brown waste. You want to keep it moist because who does the work? It's the microbes that do the worst, and they need your They need moisture just like we need water, and they need air just like we need air. So you'd want to turn it occasionally so it doesn't go anaerobic and produce methane. You know, then you have it to use in the garden. When this pile is done, you could start again, or you can have a bin system where you can keep starting different compost piles. So, all right, next, the thing that really amazes me about composting, can I have the next slide here? And these are both mine. This is my little kitchen bucket. I have this copper bucket on my, whoops, can you go back one for a second? I have this little bucket on my kitchen counter. We put our scraps in. Right now, it's just my husband and myself. We actually managed to fill it up pretty much every other day. We bring it out to the compost pile, and you can see I'm collecting compost, and I'm going to be, actually I was putting this on the garden a few weeks ago when it was dry before I planted. So next. So where should you put it? You know, you don't need the sun to make your compost pile heat up. It's going to heat up because of microbial activity. Think about it. If I just said, okay, everybody stand up, let's do jumping jacks, you're going to get hot, right? Because you're doing different activities. Your metabolism is going faster and faster and is producing that heat. So it's the microbes that produce the heat. If all you have is a sunny spot, that's fine. A shady location is good in many situations because it doesn't dry out as much. You don't want to put it in a wet area. You want it to be well drained. For your bins, we'll talk a little bit about some outdoor bin choices. For indoors, I just use that bucket. We dump it on a regular basis so it doesn't smell. If you're just going to have a few things to collect, maybe you want to get one of those nice little indoor, buckets that have the little filters in it. Or some people use the little bags. I don't really like them myself because they don't decompose that fast in my backyard compost pile, but in some situations they might be good. You'll need some tools. You want a shovel, pitchfork. If you're going to use yard waste in it, you want something to chop it up, whether it's a machete or whether it's clippers or whatever you're going to use. A thermometer is kind of fun. It's what you're creating sort of a scientific experiment when you're making your compost bin. You're trying to get it to heat up, and you can use a compost thermometer, which has a really long stem, to stick it in the pile to see what it is. And then you're going to need some ingredients. If you're doing this from the kitchen, you're probably going to have food scraps, and same thing from the vegetable garden, but you might want to think of other sources of maybe carbon, like leaves or straw or wood chips or wood shavings or whatever. And then you want to maybe do a little bit of reading. There's a lot of good books. There's a lot of good websites on composting, so you can understand a little bit more about the science behind composting. So next. So what can you compost? I actually, on our website, we have a list of 104 items that you can compost. The list will really surprise you. It's amazing what you can compost. Obviously you can get rid of your kitchen waste that way, whether it's, the peels from a cucumber or potatoes or even leftover vegetables. It's better, especially if you do have, if I just have a spoonful of green beans that have a little bit of butter on them, I will put that in the compost bin. If you have a problem with critters, you probably would not want to do that. Grass clippings, we don't recommend, we recommend you leave them on your lawn. However, sometimes you have a lot of leaves in the fall, and you can pick up some grass clippings at the same time as a source of nitrogen. Fallen leaves, if you can make the large leaves smaller, it's ideal. If not, again, with turning and mixing it, you will be able to decompose them. When you're doing some trimming, some of your hedges, you can clip it up. Pine needles are fine, don't worry about it. People think that pine needles and oak leaves are acidic, but realistically, these two plants are native plants that have adapted to our acidic environment, and our native soils are very low in a lot of nutrients like calcium and magnesium and potassium in many parts of the state. And so these plants are going to take in all these nutrients before they release them. They're pretty much neutral when they actually fall to the ground. So don't worry about putting them in your compost pile. You're going to be mixing a lot of different materials in there, and the pH is going to be 7 at the end. Coffee grounds, tea bags. I do not take out those little aluminum staples on my tea bags. Shredded newspapers. We don't get that many newspapers these days, but you get one like once a week, maybe for free. If you want to, you can just shred it up, put it in there. I wouldn't recommend large quantities of sawdust, but we have a neighbor who's a woodworker, and every so often he'll give us a bag of sawdust, and sometimes I use it in the garden. And if my compost pile is a little bit too wet, I'll add some. This is not from pressure treated wood. Many of us don't have a lot of animals, but some of us have chickens. Some of us might have like a household pet, like I happen to have a parrot. We used to have guinea pigs, and you could put there any herbivores, bedding and manure in the pile. And even if you get some junk mail, not really the glossy stuff, but if you just get some that's not too glossy, I'll just cut it up and I'll just end up tossing it in the pile as well. Some of the things to avoid next. You don't want to use any, pet droppings from cats or dogs. The problem is that they could carry bacterial organisms that can be harmful for people. You don't want to put any meat scraps or dairy products in there. And this is especially if you think you have, coyotes or raccoons or bears or neighborhood dogs and cats or any kind of undesirable creatures. You don't want to attract them to your compost pile. Unless you're planning on having a really hot pile, we just don't advise you putting the diseased plant material in there. This is something that you would either bury or just put it out with the regular trash. You wouldn't want to put any coal or charcoal ashes, obviously, because of the heavy metals and the stuff that they use to cause it to burn. Even though they've changed the inks and to soy-based inks, we just don't recommend putting in glossy or colored magazines or newspapers in the pile. The comic section, however, is typically okay. You wouldn't want to use any plants, material that you knew were sprayed with the pesticide. You wouldn't want to use any grass clippings that you knew had herbicides applied to them. Invasive weeds, what do you do with all those garlic mustard plants? You can eat them. They're actually pretty good in stir fries if you get them when they're young, but you wouldn't want to put invasive weeds that have seeds or roots into your pile, again, unless it's going to be a hot pile. And obviously you wouldn't want to use sawdust from any kind of pressure treated wood. Even the newer pressure treated wood still have copper and ammonium in them, and you probably wouldn't want to add that to a pile. So those are some suggestions. Again, go to the Soil Labs website. You could see the 104 items that you can compost. So as far as bins go, so next. You have a lot of options. Pick the one that works for you. If you don't even want to have a bin and you just want to have a pile, that is fine. You don't necessarily need to have it corralled, but it does look a little bit neater. And if you live in an area where there's neighbors, that might be something that they would consider it more attractive and not complain. If you want to have a hot pile, you really almost need something close to 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet. And you can use the new pressure treated wood, but you wouldn't want to put the sawdust in the pile. You could use the wood to make a wooden bin. Cedar's fine. There's a lot of those black rubber or plastic bins out there. Most of the towns that are having compost bin sales where you can purchase a bin at a reduced rate are offering these recycled plastic bins. And they range in price from maybe $50 to you could get really fancy ones that cost a lot more. You can just you could build a real simple wire cage. You can use chicken wire, or you can use some hardware cloth. You could put it in a square, fashion into a circle, whatever your fancy is. Again, there isn't a real right or wrong. It's what materials that you have. You don't have to go out and spend a lot of money to have a successful compost pile. And then there's a lot of tumblers. The reason, and these do vary from very small ones to very large ones, and the price goes up with the size. The thing that's the good thing about tumblers is you can secure many of them to keep out most common pest animals. The bad thing about tumblers is you're limited to how much you can put inside there, because it gets harder and harder to turn the larger the tumbler and the more that it's filled. So just to show you some examples, so next. This is just one of those, one of the plastic ones that was that some of the different towns and municipalities are using for their compost bin sales. And it's good because it contains your waste, and it does keep a lot of animals out. You can get a screen on the bottom and they keep pests out. The problem with these is you can't really see what's going on. Some of them don't have very good aeration holes, so you would want to turn it, or some people have actually just got their drill out and they've just drilled holes in it. The compost comes out of a little door on the bottom. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult to get to, and we often recommend people just pick the whole thing up and move it on the side, and then they take the top off, and then they could turn their compost into it, and they could do the same thing when they're harvesting. So that's just one example. So next we have some compost cages. And again, I've had people make them out of the wood pallets. I have had people, I've seen people make them out of hardware cloth, chicken wire. You can make ones where you can open the door. You can use snow fencing. You know, you can use cinder blocks. You know, it's really what you have available to you, and sort of your imagination of what you can use. Next. So these are like the drum composters. So these usually have a side door. You put your material in there, and then one of the things that you do have to realize is that in these, everything will just sink to the bottom, right? So you do have to be pretty good about turning it, because if you put too much green stuff in, and we'll talk about carbon nitrogen ratios in just a moment or two. If you put too much in and it's too wet, it's all going to sit at the bottom, and you're going to get anaerobic decomposition. It's going to smell when you go in there to put some more stuff in there, and you're producing methane. So do keep in mind that these, you would really have to turn it, because they don't have as great aeration as some. And then next, if you really feel like going out and building these, this actually, if you're in Haddam, at the Haddam Extension Office, I believe the extension offices are still closed, but the Master Gardeners have a display garden there. They grow food for some of the local food banks, and they have this compost bin, and they've been, in the past, we did have classes over there so that they could show people how to compost. You know, this is nice if you have the space and if you have a lot of material. You can use this several different ways. You know, at our house, we have a 3-bin composter, and one bin is filled with kind of leaves, and sometimes I have some leftover straw and stuff. It's just a source of carbon. And then we start one pile in bin number 1, and then when that gets to the point we don't want to add any more, we just let it decompose, and then we start another one in bin number 2. Other people use bin number 1 for starting their pile. They turn it into bin number 2. They turn that into bin number 3, and they start all over again. So there isn't really necessarily a right or wrong way to use these. It's something that you need to think about, what would work out best for you. And then you can always, so next, this is one of my master composters actually was making these out of recyclable containers. So you can use your imagination, and if you want to create your own compost bin, I'd say go for it. So what do you need for good compost? Next. So you need a material that contains, you know, carbon, which we would consider brown material. You need a material that contains nitrogen, which we consider green material. The microbes need oxygen. They need moisture. And then you need soil microorganisms. And no, you do not necessarily have to inoculate your pile, just like that head of lettuce that you left in your vegetable container for too long and you pick it up and it's all slimy. If there's food sources for them, microbes will come. They're everywhere. So next. So how fast decomposition is going to occur? So again, so the composting is basically human accelerated decomposition. You're trying to produce conditions so that the microbes can more readily decompose the material and transform it into compost. And that would depend upon how coarse your materials are. You know, large materials will take obviously longer to decompose than small materials. This person had sent me a photo. You could see there's a little machete in there, and he would go out back when he needed to release some stress and chop up his stuff for his compost pile. If you do want a hot compost pile, you need to have some sort of critical mass, and it would be at least 3 by 3 by 3 to like 5 by 5 by 5. That's usually manageable for one person to be able to turn. You need to have a moderate amount of moisture, like 45 to 60% of moisture. You need to have at least 5% oxygen. And you would like the ratio of carbon to nitrogen to be about 25 times as much carbon as nitrogen. And then it really depends too, if it's really freezing outside, it's 10 degrees, you're not going to get that much composting. So decomposition is much faster in the warmer weather. So next. As far as the carbon to nitrogen ratio, this is in a more scientific, and then I'll mention browns to greens in just a minute. think about every single cell in your body, in a plant. We all have carbon in it and we have nitrogen in it. Depending upon the proportion of carbon to nitrogen will determine how fast, carbon sort of acts as a source of energy for the microbes, and nitrogen acts as a source of food. Think about nitrogen is in all protein. So nitrogen is protein. It's sort of a food source. So depending upon how much carbon and nitrogen is available, will influence how fast your pile decomposes. And ideally, if you want to have a fast decomposing pile, and by fast, I mean maybe anywhere from, I don't know, depending on the feedstocks, 30 days to 6 months or something like that, maybe even a year, depending upon what you're putting in the pile. You would like there to be about 25 to 30 times as much nitrogen as carbon. Now, how would you determine this? Most of us would just go to a table. So next. You can find these tables in books. You can find them online, and they'll list a whole bunch of different materials or feedstocks that you would put into your compost pile and how much carbon to nitrogen. And I kind of liken this as, if you kind of think about it, if you have a bowl, someone gives you a bowl of shredded wheat, right, and says to eat it. It's going to take you a long time to eat it if it's a dry piece of shredded wheat, right? You're going to take a piece, you're going to put a little piece in your mouth, and it's going to be kind of dry and crunchy, and you're not going to really be able to make it malleable so you can swallow it. So the carbon to nitrogen in that case would be high. It would have a lot more carbon than it does to nitrogen. Then if you put milk on your shredded wheat and your shredded wheat gets a little bit soggy, it's easier for you to decompose, right? So think of that something that has a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio. So it's more decomposable, it's more digestible to you. And it's the same thing that's true with the microbes in your compost pile. If there's a lot of carbon, but there's hardly any nitrogen, there's hardly any food, the decomposition is going to go really slow because they don't have a lot to eat, right? So they're just going to take a little bit at a time, And then if your carbon nitrogen ratio is closer to 25 or 30 to 1, there's a lot more food in proportion to the amount of energy, so decomposition can go faster. So that's really the scientific way to look at it. The more common way to look at it would be browns to green. So next. So think about it this way, dry brown material would be your high carbon. That would include things like leaves or straw or wood chips. And then your fresh green material would be high in nitrogen. So usually it's green. You think of food waste or you think of grass clippings. But also some things that are brown are really green, like coffee grounds have a lot of nitrogen in there. Different types of meals like alfalfa meal or blood meal or cottonseed meal. Manures obviously are brown, but they actually have a relatively low carbon nitrogen. And some of the, different types of fertilizers like malorganite. I'm not suggesting you use it, but that has it's composted biosolids. And so ideally what you'd like to do is like 1 part of green to 2 to 4 parts of brown. But again, it depends how brown it is. It's really hard without doing out, scientific calculations, which most backyard composters don't really need to do. If you had stuff like leaves, you think about a leaf. A leaf's kind of pliable, even though it's brown. You could use like 1 part of food waste to maybe 2 parts of leaves. Or even 4 parts of leaves. If you had something that wasn't quite that decomposable, say shredded paper or straw or shredded twigs or something that you were using as prunings, maybe you would use 1 part of green to maybe 2 parts of brown. So you have to play with this. There isn't, again, it's an art as well as science. If you're doing this on a big scale like Domingo is, you really have to be more aware of what the different proportions of carbon to nitrogen, the moisture content, the bulk density and stuff like that. But for a home composter, you want to play with this a little bit. So next. So I only have like 6 more slides. So what are you doing? The whole thing about composting, who does the work? It's the microbes. So it's your job as the compost keeper is you want to make sure that these microbes are at the best environment that they have to decompose. And how do you do that? Again, by providing sufficient amounts of carbon, of nitrogen, of air, of water, and you're just basically making conditions so that these guys, these little guys that you can't even see, they're microscopic, can do the work. In fact, realistically, they're so tiny, but we can't even imagine how many there are in our pile, and there isn't really enough time to go into the what do you call soil food web. But one big handful of garden soil can contain as many microbes as there are people on this planet Earth. It's really incredible how many microbes that there are. So next. So a lot of times you see in books, and we often recommend people do this if they want to start a hot compost pile, is to try starting with layers. And these are just some examples of some of the things you could put in layers. And why would you do it? It gives you a little bit of an idea of the proportion. So if you put down 6 inches of leaves, and then you put down 1 inch of manure, and then you put down 6 inches of leaves, obviously you have to do this in the fall when you have leaves, unless you are stockpiling them. And then you could build up your pile, and then you could kind of see, is it warming up in 2 or 3 days? Is it not doing anything? You can kind of decide from how you made your pile if it's working or not working. We often recommend that you use different types of materials. You alternate between, like heavier wet materials and drier, more fluffier materials. And so just think about what you have available. And again, if you want a hot pile, you would have to make it pretty much at one time. And it would have to be a minimum of 3 cubic feet to probably a maximum of 5 cubic feet, because that's what most people could handle. You would make big ones if you were doing this on a commercial basis. And then after you make all these layers, what next? Next, you're going to turn it. And so again, they don't have to be really strict layers. And a lot of times people don't have enough stuff. Like right now, if you're composting, what do you have? Your leaves are pretty much gone. Maybe if you did compost, they're there from last year, maybe you have a little bit left. But this time of year, you don't have as many materials, so you can't, it's harder to make your pile a lot higher and to get that really hot composting. If you do it in the fall, you have a lot more of Mother Nature's materials between all the leaves falling down, all the garden debris, all the waste. You've been doing all this canning, you've been peeling all these cucumbers. And so you have a lot more to add. So you can't, it's something that, again, it depends upon your particular situation. If you want to be scientific about it, next. And when should you turn the pile? If you were able to make like a pile that was about 4 by 4 by 4, and you got it the right proportions of carbon and nitrogen, you had moderate amounts of moisture, you have enough air in there, it should start heating up in 3 or 4 days. You can stick the compost thermometer in, and it's going to read anywhere from 140 to maybe 160 degrees. And you would turn it when it gets down to about 100. And then you turn it again, and it would get up to maybe not quite as high as it did the first time. And then it would come down again to 100, and you keep turning it until you get to the point where you turn it and you don't notice any increase in thermal activity at all. And at that point in time, you should not be able to if the pile was properly made and enough time has passed, you should be able to not recognize the majority of the materials in that pile. You are going to find any of those little stupid stickers if you leave them on your fruit or your vegetables when you put the peels in there. Yes, you're going to have things like peanut shells, and you're going to have things like almond shells, and you're going to have peach pits in there, but these won't decompose that rapidly. But you can just put them back in the pile. They're fine to be in there. They just aerate it. So what are some common compost problems? So next. Oftentimes people complain you're not doing anything, and you want to kind of think about the carbon nitrogen. If you just have a big pile of leaves and there's no nitrogen, it's not going to do that much. So think about, do you have good proportions of carbon to nitrogen, like 2 or 3 times as much carbonaceous materials as nitrogenous material? Is the pile moist? Is it really tiny? If it's a tiny little pile, even if it's made properly, it's still not going to heat up. Does it get too much of an ammonia odor? That could be because you're feeding it too much of green or high nitrogen feedstocks. What to do? You can add some source of carbon. We often, again, keep some leaves handy. Sometimes I have some, what do you call it? The shredded wood that you use for animal shavings. I have some wood shavings that I could add in there. If it smells rotten, it's usually gone anaerobic. It's too wet. You could get this after several days of rain, which is why if you noticed on that 3-bin composter, there was that corrugated top. And if it's going to pour for a few days, you could just put the top down. If it's dry and it's rainy, you could take the top off. And then pests, again, I can't give you one overall way to avoid all pests, but oftentimes if you bury the foods, that keeps a lot of curious creatures out. You could use screens. You could use, smaller size, what do you call, like chicken wire or the hardware cloth to keep them out. You could use fencing. And if you notice that after you put such and such out to the pile, then the neighborhood raccoon comes visit it, then don't use that particular material. Think of another way to recycle it. And then uses for compost. Next. So you add it to garden soil. I'm just going to say, don't add too much. I run the soil testing lab here, and you cannot believe the people's vegetable gardens, every single nutrient except potassium, which is low in most compost, just so you know that, is almost off the chart. Just because something's good doesn't mean everything in moderation. So, we suggest people, if you use a manure-based compost, maybe add a ½ inch of compost per year. If you're using a leaf-based compost, which is lower in nutrients, maybe you could use 2 inches. If you have extra compost, you could top dress your lawn. You could use it in your garden beds. Some people like to sieve it, and especially if you have a hot compost, you could use it as a component in seed starting mix, or you can use it in other types of potting mixes, or you can make your own tea. So there's really, this is just a very short, presentation on some things to think about if you're creating your compost pile, or if you have a compost pile and it's not doing what you want it to do, maybe some things to think about. I'm here to answer any questions, and then I just have one last slide. So everybody can compost, not because a rind is a terrible thing to waste, but also, again, you can make a difference in by doing this. And so I strongly suggest and urge you to try it, and to encourage your friends and your neighbors to do also. So thank you very much. I'll be, here for questions.
Well, Dawn, again, thank you very much. That was really very educational. And we're here now with Domingo and Dawn. We're with questions. Jen, if you'll take over with questions.
So Domingo got kicked out of the Zoom. I sent him the link, so hopefully he'll be back in a minute.
Okay.
So I can start with a question that I think would be good for Dawn. You sort of answered this, Dawn, but someone asked if you can make a compost that has just lawn and paper waste. Would that work, or would that have too much carbon?
Again, this is where you would have to vary your ratio. So yes, you could do that. You would just have to figure out, maybe put down 2 inches of paper waste, an inch of lawn clippings, and do that. Make several of these layers, mix it all together, and see what happens after a few days to a week. If it doesn't not heat up, then it's not a good proportion. If it starts smelling like ammonia, then you're putting in a little bit too much grass clipping. So it's sort of an experiment. It's like you really do have to experiment with the materials that you actually have on hand. Let's see what else.
All right, wouldn't let me unmute.
Domingo, back.
Welcome back, Domingo. Someone asked a question at the beginning about sink garbage disposals. It wasn't fully written out. Rick, do you want to share what you were asking about garbage disposals? Looks like Rick might have stepped away. The way I would interpret that question is it okay to use a garbage disposal? Are there negatives, positives? What should people think about?
I mean, doesn't it? So I don't have a garbage disposal. I don't have a dishwasher either. So, we kind of live a little bit more of the old-fashioned way, but the material you're putting down in the garbage disposal, I'm assuming is going to either go into either your septic tank or into the city sewers, right? So my suggestion would be to not waste it and to compost it. I don't know how you could actually, could you use a garbage disposal to grind it up and collect it and put it on your pile? I don't know.
I do know someone who used a garbage disposal in a new one in making apple cider. So used it to take the apple pulp and turn it into a nice mushy pulp. So if you had some sort of freestanding arrangement or some way of collecting it, I expect that would be a very good way of breaking it down.
Chop it up in small pieces, that's for sure. And someone had asked about eggshells too. I don't worry about them. You know, somebody gave me actually a whole big jar of eggshells, and what they did is they dried them all out and they rolled them with a rolling pin, and they thought they needed to put them into little pieces to add them to their compost pile. I'm not that fussy. I just, whether it's cooked or whether it's raw, I just put the eggshells in. I find that some of the little critters in the compost pile really like to live in the little eggshells, and that's fine. And it's the same thing in my worm bin. I find little worms in the eggshells. They're going to break down over time. If it makes people feel happier to dry them out and to crush them into smaller pieces, by all means, they could do that. But I don't see any reason why you just can't toss them in the way they are. I don't know if, Domingo, you might think differently because you're doing it on a bigger scale. But.
Yes, well, you know, for me, it's all about particle size. So as long as we can reduce the particle size, it goes a long way for speeding up the decomposition process. You know, even after, of course, the shells are sometimes very hard to decompose compared to other, you know, more sugar-based type of food scraps. And even after 60 days, you might have little pieces of eggshells that you'll recognize. But they're all adding calcium to your compost, and overall is a good feedstock to have.
Thank you. This is a question for you, Domingo. How do you stay safe riding your bike year round?
Well, you know, that's a good question. You know, one of the reasons I do bikes and trailers because it was the most accessible thing. We had our bike already, and then we just need to purchase a trailer. And the harsh of the winter, of course, is the most difficult one because, you know, of the wind, of the humidity, you know, it affects your hands, affects your feet. So you need to bundle up, you know, 3 layers, you know, cover very well your neck and your head. You have good gloves. It's a hard time to do, but once you start biking, you heat up and it's not that bad. Is a wind that really can kill you, and days where it's pretty humid. But you know, we're committed to this. You know, if the earth doesn't stop, we don't stop. At least that's the motivation. And I have a very hardcore bikers, people that really love to bike. They prefer to be there than be in an office. So that's how you do it.
Excellent. Don, you spoke a little bit about not putting in coal ash. Is ash from a wood fire okay to add?
I wouldn't add it because the pH of wood ashes is 11. And what happens is if you put something like that, there's calcium oxides and potassium oxides and stuff like that in the ash. So if you add that to your compost pile, basically what happens is it converts the nitrogen that that would be in a form that the plants could take up into ammonia, which is a gas. So it kind of goes up. So you're decreasing the amount, you're changing the pH of the compost probably unnecessarily high, and you're losing nitrogen. So I would suggest you would use that as a liming material. So if you have, we tell people if you want to use wood ashes, you can use 1.5 times as much wood ashes as limestone. So if we told you to use 5 pounds of limestone per, say, 100 square feet to raise the pH of a garden, you could use 7.5 pounds of wood ashes. And I used to be able to tell people that a 1 pound coffee container contained 1 pound of wood ashes, but they don't make 1 pound coffee containers anymore. So however many ounces of a coffee container you have, that's how many ounces of wood ashes you would have. So that's what I would do with that.
Beth asks if it's okay to chip or shred any invasive brush and put that in the compost pile.
You'd like to make sure that it's maybe sat out in the sun for a few days so that some of the invasives have a tendency to root from the tiniest little cutting, and you really wouldn't want that to happen. So I would say let them sit out in the sun, let them cook for a while, make sure they're really dead. Or if you put them in the compost pile, make sure they really get up to 150 degrees and it really kills them. Yeah. You know, it is a problem with a lot of invasives. They're tough.
Yeah, something I want to mention is that the heating up of the systems depends on the reproduction of your microbes there. Through respiration, that's the way they go about, really breaking down the carbon. And the only ways for things to heat up is, like you Dawn said, you create these conditions, the condition of the carbon to nitrogen, your parts, the moisture level, the aeration level. If you have that right, things will heat up, and that's the temperature will tell you. And of course, to be able to kill pathogens, to be able to kill weeds, you have to, bring it up to, above 130 for several days. And it can be done in a backyard compost, but you need the management. You have to be on top of it. And that's why, if you're not going to do it, you prefer to have larger systems, at least 3 by 3 by 3. But it's that you create the conditions, and it can be done.
Great. And the
Domingo,
last-
how do people get your services? Is there, how do you market it? I mean, how do people participate in your program?
Okay, let me tell you something. I like always to do this. 98% of the people that compost with me are women. Okay, the women are the ones that are supporting compost services like mine. So they're making the decision about having this service. Basically, word of mouth. I don't do much marketing. The marketing is done by biking around the town, and people say, "What the hell are you doing?" But then you stop and you talk to people, and then you talk about these things that I talked before. What's happened with the trash? We're burning it. We're pushing the wrinkle. We are not, and we want to grow food, but our soils are not good. And in that conversation, suddenly, people apply, and then they talk to somebody else. So I tend to find people that are already there, that doesn't need much convincing. I don't have a large capacity. So to make it sustainable, I work with those that want to help themselves. That's how I want to say it. I cannot help those that do not. It's hard for me. I'm a small scale operation. And things have picked up. I have around 420 composters with me. Multiply that by 2.5, which is the average size of household. That tells you more or less the population that I can attend. But the women are the guiding force behind my in the sense that, and of course, these are women that are young women, some of them professional women, others women that have come from California, Oregon, San Francisco, the people that have composted before, and they don't see it any other way. And of course, you have some that are discovering composting, and then they're hooked. So it's transformative that way. But I like is that day by day conversation. Now you see more towns out there that are doing not like mine with bikes. They do it with trucks and pickup, and they are haulers. Basically, they are picking up from your town, bring it to New Milford Farms, which is a composting company. They bring it to New England Compost, which is another composting, which I think they stopped now receiving food scrap, and now they're taking it to the anaerobic digester. So there are a lot of services, but different from mine, as I explained, the idea is to keep it in our place, to use it in our place. It's hard to get compost back once it gets out of the city. And for that, you'd probably be charged if you want compost from your system.
Tony and Liz, there are 2 outstanding questions. Do we have time to answer those?
Yeah,
or
we'll
should we
take those
wrap up?
2 and then,
All right, question 1 is for Domingo from Jen, asking, what advice do you have for jumpstarting community composting programs locally in our towns?
That's a good question. Listen, if you have community gardens, if you have a land trust, if you have, a garden club, these are places where people are closer to working with soil. They understand or want to understand about soil health. I might see an opportunity to look at, diversion of food waste as a way to enhance their soils for their end use. So this is very important. If you go just to talk about, and of course, the idea is to how this is linked to all other aspects, like I try to do. It's not about soil amendment anymore alone. It's also about not polluting. It's about human health. I try to bring as much people, different audiences, different stakeholders, and see how all these things are linked. But I would start to find a community garden or an urban farm, even a school that might be gained for something like this, and start developing a small pilot with a nice 3-bin system that can hold 64 cubic feet of material, and develop an experience, because at the end it's transformative. Once you put all the scraps and then suddenly in a matter of 30 days, if you've done things properly, things are broken down to a point that you can use it as mulch, or wait until 6 months for actually use it, and then say, wow, we are in the regenerative process. We are not taking anymore, we're not extracting anymore, we're not degrading our place anymore, we're helping to regenerate our place. And that's exciting, at least for me. And if it's for me, there's many people out there that I'm sure. So that's where I would start, to find a community, a community of value, a community that wants a certain end use, and try to start that way.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, and the final question is about building a compost screener. I once saw something about building one from a bicycle tire and haven't been able to find it. And so wondering, one, if you know how to do that, or if either of you have advice on how to build your own compost screener.
We just use some 2x4s with some hardware cloth. I don't know how to make one out of a bike wheel. Do you, Domingo?
Well, I used to have one, and now I gave it to Common Ground High School. But basically, we're using the rim. So we used 3 rims of 20, I think it was 26 or 27-inch rims. And we found a metallic mesh. I think it was a 1/2 inch, the size of the mesh. And we were able to put it into a wooden frame on wheels that were able to rotate. There's several examples out there online where you can follow. Ours was motorized because we were able to put a belt and be able to run it, because sometimes I'm alone, I need to sit and I can have this support somebody else that can be pushing the rolling trommel. So the designs out there, if you contact me, I can try to send it to you, but they are there and they're very useful, and it's less time consuming than others, and they come very nice, very fine.
Okay, great, terrific. Again, Dawn and Domingo, thank you so much. That was so instructive and informative. I know our audience really appreciated it. It was great.
Thank you.
There's not enough time for me to thank everyone that was part of this series. But if you go to our website and you look at our program, you can see the number of people that participated from the first series. So that's the conclusion of the program this evening and our series on waste. Thank you very much. And again, thank you to Dawn and Domingo. Great.
Thank you.